between war's end and 1965, more than 70 million births occurred in a country that before the war had under 135 million souls. The horror of the baby boomers was unleashed upon us all. There's no end of stories to tell about America's boomer generation. They are the ones who came of age during the 1970s, creating what passes for American culture. Disco? Their fault. They are the ones who crafted the American welfare state. And from it, their in-progress retirement has broken the federal budget. They are the ones who grew up in the shadow of the new manufacturing complexes that sprouted up after World War II, when the rest of the world was wrecked, and then watched bitterly as those same facilities relocated as the rest of the world recovered under the order. From Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Johnson to Trump, from civil rights to long commutes, from the sexual revolution to technological invalidity, their collective decisions and foibles have determined precisely what America is. Most of the rest of the world had a boomer generation as well, and for similar formulative reasons. War's end, plus the dawning of the new, mostly war-free age under American sponsorship, enabled most governments to busy themselves with their people's lives without needing to burden themselves with the task of national defense. European governments in particular spent a lot more time and energy trying to make their people's lives comfortable and a lot less trying to kill all their neighbors. Many countries the world over developed and experienced the same reductions in mortality of the more advanced states for the first time. Populations expanded everywhere. But relative to pre-war populations, the American boomers were a far larger cadre than their global peers. Even 170 years after independence, and with a 30-fold expansion in population, the Americans still enjoyed a lot of open land. The Americans were still growing into the territories made vacant by the eradication of the natives. Lots of useful land meant the boomers enjoyed lots of low-cost, high-payout opportunities. In contrast, Europe had reached its land's carrying capacity decades previous, and there just wasn't much in the way of internal frontiers. Even in the newly developing countries, the countryside wasn't exactly teeming with unused territories. As we enter the 2020s, the boomers are a largely spent demographic force. Calendar years 2022 and 2023 are when the majority of the world's boomers will have turned 65 and so shifted into retirement. This generates a double hit to labor markets. The baby boomers are the largest ever generation, so their absence is hugely impactful in numerical terms. They are also the oldest economically active generation, meaning that their numbers comprise the bulk of all available skilled labor. Remove so many high-skilled workers in a short period of time, and labor shortages and labor inflation are a foregone conclusion for years to come. The next generation down is Generation X, a group that watched the trials and travails of their predecessors and did not like what they saw. There were so many baby boomers that when they entered the market, they outcompeted each other for wages, suppressing labor costs. This forced many boomers to decide that two-income households were the only way to scrape by. That not only depressed labor costs more, but introduced considerable stress into interpersonal relationships, resulting in the baby boomers' high divorce rate. Gen X has attempted to avoid this outcome, to a degree. Gen X is far more likely to have single-income households compared to their elders. Generation X was already a smaller generation, and was never going to be able to fill the cavernous hole caused by the boomers' departure. But with lower labor rate participation, the result will be a far larger labor shortage. That's great for Gen X. Those who choose to work will have the best pricing power of any workforce to date. But it is a bit of a disaster for the labor market writ large. At the bottom of the scale are the Zoomers. They are eager workers, but very few exist. The Zoomers are the children of Gen X. A small generation generates a small generation. all the Zoomers that will be born have already been born. And even if they all follow in the footsteps of the baby boomers instead of their parents, and they all enter the workforce, there are nowhere near enough of them to round out the labor force for the next 2 decades. To this point, boomers, Gen Xers, and Zoomers, the picture holds globally. But now it diverges, because America's boomers did one thing their global peers did not. They had kids. A lot of them. Say what you will about America's millennial generation, and yes, there is a lot we can say. They have something going for them that nearly no other millennial cadre globally does. They exist. Overall, the American millennial demographic group falls into 2 categories. The first matched the stereotype of entitlement and laziness and taking an extended adolescence between college and entering the workforce. The second got screwed. They attempted to be adults, but got sideswiped by the combination of boomers squeezing them out of the workforce and the mass unemployment triggered by the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis. The millennials lost years of meaningful work experience and today are the least skilled of any equivalent age cohort in modern American history. The American millennials are already the largest demographic in the workforce by number. That's great, that's essential. But the real hope is with their children. The American millennials' numbers raise the possibility that they will have enough children to someday fill the labor gap. But the soonest that will happen is when those children enter the labor force, a process that will not begin until the mid-2040s. There's the not-so-minor issue that the millennials must first have those children. At present, birth rates for millennials are the lowest in American history. So for the United States, the millennials, for all their imperfections, are rounding out the labor force to a degree. An insufficient degree by many measures, but the millennials' very existence is both a plus now and a source of hope for later. Beyond the United States, the picture is much darker, for the simple reason that most of the world's boomer cohort didn't have kids. The reasons for this lack of reproduction vary greatly from place to place. East Asia was already densely populated. Mass urbanization didn't help. Most of Europe spent its money on technical upgrades rather than making it easier to raise families. Canada is so cold, everyone flocked to the cities for warmth as soon as it was an option, and apartments are the ultimate downsizing factor for family size, no matter where they are located or why people live in them. American boomers aging into mass retirement will break the bank. But between their smaller relative size as compared to global norms, and their offspring's increasing contribution to the government's bottom line, their financial hammer blows are nothing compared to the meteor swarm of challenges that will utterly destroy the governing systems of countries as diverse as China, Korea, Japan, Thailand, Brazil, Germany, Italy, Poland, Russia, and Iran. Meanwhile, the American millennials' very existence means the United States will, at least in part, recover from its financial crunch in the 2030s. But for the rest of the world, it will never get better than it was in the 2010s. The Americans will have a small amount of company. France, in a conscious, sustained effort to outpopulate West Germany, became one of the world's most family-friendly nations. Sweden's version of social democracy entails cradle-to-grave family support. New Zealand brims with elbow room, and in a faint shadow of Australian and American policy in eras past, deliberately reduced options for its own indigenous population in order to increase options for whites. But these 3 countries, plus the United States, are the exceptions that define the rule. Everyone else's boomers failed to procreate to anything close to replacement levels. 6 decades later, the global millennial cadre of the advanced world is simply too small to even theoretically keep their nationalities in existence over the long haul. Back-of-the-envelope math done by folks who live in the intersection of demographics and statistics, which looks a lot like calculus to me, suggests that places with fair to crappy demographics like Spain, the United Kingdom, or Australia will suffer a drag on their annual growth of about 2% of GDP annually. The truly terminal demographies of Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea, and China are looking at least 4%, while the youngish populations of America and France will only suffer about a 1% reduction. Add that up for just a single decade, and it is difficult to imagine how the inevitable rise of places like Germany and China can even survive, much less function.